You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to the Modern Myth Podcast with me, your host Tristan, the archaeologist. Now today has been a journey of a decade, almost to the day. It seems that when I looked back at previously talking to my guest, it was October 2014. And I was talking to him about a film about cultural heritage in crisis. That was Saving Mes Aynak. And I'm joined today by Brent E. Huffman. And Brent, just would you mind letting our listeners know who you are and tell us a little bit about your kind of background?
Sure. So, again, my name is Brent E. Huffman. I am a professor at Northwestern University at the journalism school. And I'm also, of course, a documentary filmmaker. And I'm really passionate about human rights and social justice, and in this case, cultural heritage and where those things all sort of meet up. And like you said, I made this documentary, actually began the process way back in 2009. So it's been even longer than 10 years. It's scary how fast time flies. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about this morning.
So I'm just wondering, in terms of like placing ourselves at that time, way back when, in terms of the reception, I've been looking through all the information on Saving Mes Aynak and the kind of accolades it's got, the kind of attention it's got. How have you felt that it's been received? Has there been a time when you've been almost surprised about the impact or the outreach? Or do you feel like the story is so powerful that like you knew it should have had that kind of effect?
If we travel way back to 2009, I read a New York Times story about a Chinese government-owned mining company that was going to set up in an area controlled by the Taliban, and was going to bring in, Chinese workers. Sort of really surreal story. Bring in these kind of Chinese workers and open pit mine for copper in Logar province. Again, this Taliban-controlled area, this dangerous area. And then kind of a footnote to the story was there was some kind of archaeological remains, that may be destroyed, as a result of this open pit mine. Mm-hmm. And that sort of piqued my interest. I'm very interested in China's kind of push into the world. And I, in a rented Kabul taxi, traveled to this area, in Logar province to sort of see it for myself. And this sort of started this process of making this documentary that eventually becomes Saving Mes Aynak. And what I discover is, this footnote in this New York Times story, this archaeological site is actually this, enormous, sprawling, ancient Buddhist city that's on top of an older, Bronze Age site. So there's, 5,000 year plus history here that was all sort of set to be destroyed, basically, blown up in this open pit mining process. And what the film eventually becomes is, documenting the Afghan archaeologists who are, risking their lives to try to save, this incredible heritage, before the looming deadline and everything is exploded, everything's blown up. So it was this very sort of dramatic story. The film, as you say, came out in 2014. It eventually went to Netflix. It, played around the world on, different TV stations and film festivals and won awards. And all that was great. But really the goal was to raise awareness about this incredible site under threat, to really highlight the amazing work of these Afghan archaeologists and really to stop this from, stop this cultural heritage tragedy from happening. We can get into the details. There have been, good things that have happened. There have been really bad things that have happened. But that was the goal, is to save this incredible ancient city.
It's very interesting that if I contrast that to how, for example, archaeology is conducted in the UK or even in the US, a lot of it is what would be called salvage archaeology, in the sense that, developers coming in, archaeologists go kind of first, take off the first couple of layers, try and dig that out. And in the process of this being done, the land is meant to be kind of developed for us in the present. And it's interesting that, contrasting that with how this kind of like site, there was no real intention, from what I understand, from the company coming in who were mining for copper, to really take the time to kind of analyze that. And it kind of makes me feel that like archaeology shouldn't really always be about salvage. It shouldn't always be about trying to mitigate problems, but I think we should be also focusing on preserving that. When you were out there filming stuff, you must have filmed a lot of these different places. How much of that footage is of the site as you saw it back when you were filming? Do you have like a huge archive of like all the details, or how did you go about doing your shots in that respect?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to sort of take a step back to your previous point, I believe that, the archaeologists were calling it like rescue archaeology instead of, a normal archaeological dig, where they were, given a really finite amount of time to, in a very kind of reckless way, try to dig as fast as they can and see what's there to try to remove what they could, before this deadline. So you're right. It was this very kind of rushed, chaotic process. And I was, trying to document as many different things. And I think, you're right. I have an archive of hundreds of different artifacts from, manuscripts that were, some of the oldest manuscripts ever discovered, being pulled from the ground, to, life-size statues of Buddhist statues, to pottery, to coins, to rings, to jewelry, to architecture. So they were in this very rushed, chaotic way. The, archaeologists were discovering just hundreds of different items. My time at the site was very limited because of danger and security. And, I think I had sort of these small, like 3 to 4 hour windows where I could, a day where I could sort of document as much as I could. And then I would sort of have to leave before it started to get dark, before the site was potentially in danger from a Taliban attack. So yeah, it was definitely not like business as usual for archaeologists. It was sort of this extreme, surreal situation. And again, we were trying to save the site, but at the very least, I do have kind of a visual record of, here's what was discovered during that time. And again, here's, sort of the Afghan archaeologist contribution to this sort of incredible project.
I think that is something that is so valuable. I think sometimes, and it's an outgrowth of what archaeology has always been, which has always had roots in a kind of colonialism and in kind of imperialism, that, it's always felt that the most knowledgeable or the most best equipped to kind of do archaeology is people from generally the West going out to other countries and analyzing these past civilizations, when I think really what we all should be advocating for is platforming the voices of archaeologists in those countries, in those communities. And I think that is so valuable, because, when I hear when I think about what's happened, it's always interesting to me about what was saved and what was left. Archaeology is a lot about context. It's a lot about the environment. It's a lot about not just what, but where and when and how. And it's very interesting to me to see, was there kind of a difference between what you felt as a film director, what made it interesting shot, versus what archaeologists were digging up and saying, well, this is actually really, really fundamentally interesting. Did you feel kind of like that you kind of like were kind of going off what they were saying, or did you have a kind of a director cap on as well, in terms of the filming?
Yeah, I feel like there's two questions there that are really great. One is that this idea of of archaeology, whether it's in documentaries or on National Geographic, there was a big focus on sort of Western white male, European white male archaeologists parachuting into some place and discovering, kind of like Christopher Columbus, right? Like, yeah. I've discovered this thing that local people have known about forever and whatever. There's a long history of kind of that process, and I think it was extremely important. And this project, I'm working on a new film in Yemen, but in both projects, it's the indigenous people that are, I think, and their perspective that are most important. And it's, in Afghanistan, it's the Afghan archaeologists that I feel are the most knowledgeable. They were the ones actually doing all of the work. There was a push to not focus on them. And there was also a push, if there was some problem, to quickly blame the Afghan archaeologists, right? Oh, they did something wrong. And it was really important for me not to kind of fall into that trap and to highlight their voices and their contribution. This was really this was their project, and they were the heroes of this this work, and as they're digging, they're getting, text messages from the Taliban saying, if you don't stop this, I'm going to kill you and your family. Right. So imagine, the work is so important to them that they will ignore a text message that basically, says we're going to kill you. And then your other question, I think, is also great. I definitely had my director's hat on sort of in terms of what I thought was significant. But certainly if they were like, oh, you got to come see this. This is really important. That kind of thing was always in the documentary as well.
What do you think you kind of learnt about the process of archaeology while you were out there, while you were filming? What do you think by osmosis kind of was like, oh, okay, this is how it's done? Is there a particular thing that kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to take a step back, I'm, I guess this is obvious. I'm not an archaeologist. I come from a journalism and documentary background, though I've taken archaeological, archaeology classes before, and this sort of introduction to archaeology. I think, I don't know if this is the expected answer, but it was true in Afghanistan. Like I was surprised how political the dig was, and I was surprised by this sort of sense of in the beginning, you asked this question of like, did I expect there to be this big impact of the documentary? That I think one way I was educated on this is that archaeologists are motivated by different sort of political ideologies, I guess. And there wasn't, and this surprised me, there wasn't this sense of like, this site should be saved out of principle, or, this site should be saved because it's the right thing to do. I felt people other than the Afghan archaeologists were sort of pulled in different political, directions, whether it's, we want a relationship with China, so we're not going to sort of say what's happening here is wrong, or this idea of, sites get destroyed all the time, and there are other more important sites. There were these sort of politics involved with archaeology that surprised me. I guess naively, maybe I expected more of this sense of camaraderie, that here's this amazing heritage, it's going to be destroyed, let's all come together to save it. That was not the case at all. It was more, that was the case for the Afghan archaeologists, but any other archaeology group, I think, was pulled in a sort of political direction of, what's our relationship, with the U.S., who was, who had a big foothold and, at the site at the time. What's the relationship with China?
Oh,
yeah, it was disappointing too. Like I felt like my film made a lot of enemies, honestly. Because the message of the film didn't sort of fit in their political box of, what they wanted to say.
This is completely my wheelhouse, Brent. Like the past is unfortunately political, but that's because we live in like a political world. And I think the thing is that people's relation to the past, which I'm really, really intrigued by, I think tells us a lot about who we are as societies. It's one of those things because even in the UK, there's been a whole big political kind of cacophony about a tunnel being built through the landscape near Stonehenge, and
yes.
it's divided archaeologists. It's one of these things where, I think instead of, as an archaeologist, I try to understand things beyond the political, but I understand that it is all part of that. And especially when you're going to a different country, which has different rules and different customs and different cultures and politics and tradition, the important thing is to kind of step back from that. And I think by not taking a stance in this respect, I think that is maybe the better outcome for the documentary. Although, saying that, anybody, you'll know as making a film is making a perspective, whether it's overt or it's more subtle. And I like to think of the past as also not necessarily being translated into the present through archaeologists just showing the data or saying, oh, this is this. We have to interpret the past. And when we do that, we always put a little bit of ourselves into that. But if we're kind of cogent of that point, that we're actually expressing somewhat of ourselves in that interpretation, we can actually take the time to reflect on that a little better. Because I think it's worse to kind of have this idea that, oh, everything is just so, oh, it was just like that. It was just like that. No, actually there's perspective going on here. And it's interesting to me that like there were so many like kind of competing political interests and pressures on something that, at first glance is simply about preserving cultural heritage, which should be on everybody's kind of list. But we'll talk a little bit more about that after this very, very short break. And we're back. You're listening to Modern Myth with me, Tristan. My guest today is Brent E. Huffman, who's the director of Saving Mes Aynak. Now, we've kind of talked a little bit about obviously filming at the time and the kind of the kind of pressures around that and the kind of politics involved in that. Obviously, Afghanistan has now gone through quite a radical political transformation. I'm just wondering how, after filming and everything, did you keep contact with the archaeologists that you filmed with?
Yes, and I think this is probably the burning question of what's happening now. Honestly, this is the nightmare scenario. It's one that I didn't exactly anticipate. This idea that my country, the United States, would in many ways abandon Afghanistan. At least that's the way I see it. Would abandon this long-term partner and friend and turn its back on the country. And it was sort of a big surprise to everyone that, kind of overnight, the U.S. is no longer going to protect Afghans in Afghanistan. And, the Taliban sort of violently came in, and for the last 3 years have, obviously controlled every aspect of the country. They're in control of Mes Aynak. They're the ones now that are going to benefit from this very lucrative deal with the Chinese government, which for obvious reasons they want this to happen so they can get paid. Yeah, and it's been a horrific nightmare for Afghans. The Afghan archaeologists have all tried to flee the country, some successfully, some it's been extraordinarily difficult to try to get out, as they have like extended family members and grandparents. So it's not just about them leaving. They want to leave with their whole families. But essentially the Afghan archaeologists, because they worked with the U.S. government, Mes Aynak, the World Bank was partially funding the archaeological efforts at Mes Aynak. So because of these connections, they're under tremendous threat from the Taliban for religious reasons too. A lot of the main characters are of a different religion than the Taliban. So there's persecution that happens because of that. So there are sort of multiple reasons why the Taliban want to, either lock up or execute these these heroic Afghan archaeologists. So a big effort of mine has been to try to help them to get out of the country, which is, as you can probably imagine, extraordinarily difficult. Yeah. And now the big news is just in August, the MCC, this Chinese government-owned company, has been given the green light to start mining. They've actually formally started that process of mining. Mes Aynak has not been destroyed yet, but that's sort of the looming thing that, all of us in heritage that are related to this story have, I think, been trying to, stop the site from being destroyed and trying to get the Taliban. I mean, imagine we're trying to get the Taliban and this Chinese government-owned company to mine in a different way to save the site. I mean, it's the worst possible scenario that could ever happen, probably. Yeah, and that's sort of what we're facing now.
It's sad that it's kind of come to this. I mean, obviously, I can't imagine what it's like to be in that situation in any capacity. I think it's one of those things where it feels as if, some sort of, global connected effort would be useful and beneficial in this way to kind of prevent this kind of almost like, this kind of green lighting. But it's unfortunately, I guess, part of the flow of history. And it's just, partially fortunate that there has been this, this kind of documentary to kind of at least save a slice of time in which, the attempts were made to do as much as possible. It's interesting to me that your focus continues to be on stories of cultural heritage that are under threat. So, as I understand, you're currently working on a documentary about cultural heritage in Yemen. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. So, in a very similar vein, in some ways, it's a shared story between Afghans. So I've been working on this project, at least sort of attempting to get access for at least 5 years, honestly. And to maybe take a little step back again, if my family were here, my young children were a part of this conversation, I think they would also sort of notice I have this. I sometimes describe it as this sort of dysfunction in my brain, maybe, where I'm very attracted to stories where there's a human rights story or this cultural heritage at risk story that is in many ways impossible to tell, or I'm told from people involved that it's an impossible story. So in many ways, the Mes Aynak story was an impossible story. No one wanted to talk about this. No one wanted to be on camera. Access to the site was extraordinarily difficult. The list sort of goes on and on. And Yemen is that same way. Like, just to get a visa to Yemen took me, almost a year, if you can believe it. Mm-hmm. And then the visa is just like the starting point to getting many different levels of access. Yemen is an extraordinarily sort of complicated and divided country. But my plan was to tell a story, again, like the Mes Aynak story, of Yemeni people trying to save cultural heritage in different parts of the country during an active, war, right? So Yemen has been essentially in sort of a civil war for, over 10 years. And if you follow the news, that continues, and the bombing, that's happening in Yemen continues. Just last week, it's being sort of actively bombed. So the idea was, again, in this sort of impossible story, but this very compelling story, try to get access to Yemen, and try to highlight these individuals that are, again, risking their life to try to save heritage while their world is being sort of actively bombed, right? Sort of, I think this really sort of compelling story. In Saving Mes Aynak, I always felt really bad that there weren't women, subjects in the film. Like, it's a very male film, and part of that is, just simply the Afghan archaeologists working at Mes Aynak were all male, and it was a cultural thing. And for a man to interview a woman, like especially a foreign man to interview a woman in any way in Afghanistan, is a very tricky, cultural process that's very, very difficult. So in this new film in Yemen, I'm really trying to focus on, women, Yemenis, cultural heritage specialists and archaeologists, again, trying to save heritage. And Yemen, it's a relatively small country, has just this, treasure trove of history and sort of importance in the world. It has 5 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, all of which are under threat from war or from climate change. Something we haven't talked about yet is the way climate is also, threatening every part of heritage, really. Looting is happening at Mes Aynak, looting is happening in Yemen. So there's kind of this perfect storm of all of these threats happening in Yemen in some of the most incredible, heritage sites that, especially in the United States, that really no one knows about. So much like Afghanistan, the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes in the U.S. around Yemen are all about, war and famine. And really, they know nothing about this rich heritage that is disappearing and that Yemeni people are fighting to try to preserve.
I think that is the human story that's at the heart of these kind of things. And I think, it's very easy for people to, disengage themselves. I mean, we kind of do live in a society where we almost have this information overload, and it's difficult to kind of contend with all the conflict going around the world, that really these are things impacting people's daily lives, and that in those same situations, we may also find ourselves, were we in the middle of a conflict, attempting to make the best of the situation and preserve heritage in our own areas as well. And I think that joining that line is, I think, the way to kind of get to people, because I think ultimately, providing a kind of human face to these kind of situations sometimes is the panacea to, the kind of relentless scrolling or the relentless news feed where, numbers are chucked around and you almost get desensitized to things like, the consequences of war and conflict. I'm really glad you brought up climate change, because within archaeology as a sector, like, climate change is talked about quite a lot. There are some groups that kind of like focus on it. I know for many of the associations, there's kind of like impact assessments going on and everything. But I think in the general population, there's a kind of disconnect I find sometimes between what people feel heritage and history is about and what people are, what the profession or even community groups are doing. And what I really liked when I was reading about the work you do is coming back to what you're saying about your drive to kind of find out about things that you're told are impossible. Finding those oft forgotten voices is actually what like modern archaeology really is, because for so long history has been about, kings and royalty and large battles and everything. But nowadays, archaeologists are trying to find the small pieces of human daily life, the people who lived alongside all these warriors, these kings, these queens, these like very important people. Like, how can we find more about the people who live daily? So for me, there's that, that connection of finding the people who don't usually get talked about, or the stories that don't usually get talked about, and the way that we actually practice archaeology and trying to dig up the stories that are not really spoken about properly. Do you see that connection when I speak about it?
I do, yeah. And I think you make so many great points. I'd love to respond to.
Please.
I totally agree that in many ways, history is told by, the victors of war and like you say, the sort of kings and the queens and the nobility and the lives of the everyday people like us, like all of us sort of get lost in that sort of telling, that sort of vein of telling a story. And in many ways, again, when you in Mes Aynak and the Afghan people in this Yemen project, these Yemeni people that live in the areas, like they're the ones that really have that connection to the past, right? In some way, telling their story and connecting it to the story in the past, I think is much more telling about the area and the region than, again, this sort of bullet point of war and politics and things like that. This sort of everyday story and the indigenous people's connection to that history, right? And the way the history sort of continues. Mm-hmm. That's something that's also amazing in Yemen is you have, for example, like the mud brick architecture that's really incredible, right? You have it's sort of this passed on tradition that modern Yemeni people actually have this kind of incredible connection to, thousands of years of history and this passed on heritage. The other thing that you said that I think is really great is, especially in the West, but especially in the United States, there is this disconnect now between, or almost this push to be more insular, right? Like, we're Americans. We only care about what's happening in America. This is a faraway story. It's Afghanistan. It's Yemen. We have our own problems. We no longer care about the rest of the world. There is this sort of this way of thinking now that's very prevalent especially in the United States. And in both films, in the Mes Aynak film and the new Yemen project, I don't want to just sort of accept that there are these audiences that are lost to us. I want to, tell stories to the widest possible audience. And as you mentioned, connecting to people on an emotional level, on a personal, smaller human level. In the Saving Mes Aynak story, it's Kadir, the Afghan archaeologist who, it's through his emotion and his love of his own country's heritage that I hope is sort of infectious, and that audiences, when they watch, can feel, empathy and a connection with him, and through that feel a connection to Afghanistan and see their own story in a way reflected in Kadir's story. And that's something I'm trying with the Yemen project too, to, again, these smaller personal stories of devotion to cultural heritage, almost as these kind of windows for people in, other countries like the United States to find common themes and connect emotionally, And I think documentary as a visual medium, as a storytelling medium, I'm biased, but I believe it has the strongest potential to do that, to connect, on an emotional level with an audience, so that through feeling something, hopefully they come to care about these stories. That again, in a bigger sense, a lot of the world is very sadly turning away from.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And in spirit of taking a step back, since, that's what we're in that vibe right now. I think it's really important for us to also think about, when you're saying about the widest audience possible, I'm kind of interested in, at the time, the reception to the film Saving Mes Aynak in Afghanistan, and whether, as an American coming to these countries, having your kind of background is filming for, or in your mind, your experience of documentary films is, Western. Like, is there something that you do to kind of translate it to a broader audience that's different from if you made a documentary purely with an American or a Western audience in mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's complicated. I think there's one, which is everything is complicated, I guess. And I certainly make mistakes. So I will not say I've perfected some method to do this. I certainly haven't. But I think one thing, again, that I think I sort of alluded to this before, there's a push to reach American audiences by like placing an American in an important part of the story, right? And that's something I really hate and I'm really against. So in Saving Mes Aynak, I am not a character. Like it's not my story of coming to Afghanistan and meeting people, right? But I think there is this push, especially in the United States, to like have American, white male American as the central character, right? And it's through their perspective that you reach the American audience. And I really, like I said, I hate that and try to push back against that. So I still want to reach an American audience, but as you say, because, I don't want to make this, as much as I can, everything is subjective, of course, but as much as I can, I don't want to make this like the white male American story. I want to try to tap in and give voice to, right, local people. And as much as I can, I want the films to be their story, right? So that means I really have to collaborate with local people, with local producers. And for both films, I'm working with a local producer to really make sure I do that justice. And again, not only is there not white male American main subject, but I want to make sure like culturally, this is sort of an accurate representation of their story, right? Of the Afghan person or Yemeni person. With that said, that is not a format, I think, that is easily digestible for a Western audience, right? Because, you have to read subtitles, it is a person that's culturally different than you. Mm-hmm. So there is some kind of heavy lifting, I guess, getting this to an audience. But that's been my goal to highlight these indigenous voices and to really, as much as I can, try to make it their story and then try to get that story to the widest possible audience I can. And it's been difficult, but there's, like you said, there's been some success with Saving Mes Aynak of trying to do just that.
And so the new film, has it got a title yet, or is it all tentative? And when would we expect to be seeing that new film that you've got currently in production?
Yeah, so it is the tentative title is the very tentative title is Saving the Cultural Heritage of Yemen, and I'm looking at many different cities so far. So it'll probably be, again, a feature-length film, but where we're sort of traveling to different locations, highlighting different voices from, Houthi-controlled areas in the north, like Sanya, which is one of the longest inhabited, cities in the world, to Marib, that has this incredible Queen of Sheba history and these sort of incredible temples devoted to her, to cities like Taz that are kind of caught in the middle, that are literally split down the center of the city, where the civil war is like happening right in the middle. So you have castles that have been partially bombed and libraries that have been firebombed, and you have people kind of caught in the crosshairs doing heritage work. I'm hoping that the film will be completed next year in 2025, but it's because I'm attracted to difficult stories that have lots of difficult aspects to them. It's been a slow process, but one that I'm devoted to.
No, it's very worthwhile. I grew up in Northern Ireland post the Good Friday Agreement, which was the kind of market ceasefire agreement there, and even with that, I only realized when I moved to Scotland that a lot of my childhood was very much informed by the Troubles, even in peacetime. And, growing up in a country that's kind of like just post-conflict, you kind of like, it makes me feel a connection somewhat to people undergoing that, because even though I don't understand necessarily the ins and outs of these kind of situations, I think there is this kind of sense of anxiety or fear or concern, that I think I understand the draw that you have. I maybe in a different life, I would be doing something the same, because I think these stories that are, the difficult ones, I think that's all the more reason for them to be platformed, because at the end of the day, life overall, without getting too philosophical about this, is it's difficult, and we can kind of like sometimes sit in our wee bubbles, and I'm not suggesting that somebody needs to go out and experience conflict, but we need to always be ready to take like a trip out of our comfort zone to kind of understand and empathize more with people. Just kind of finally, I know that you are currently a professor, is it? At it Medill? Yeah, Northwestern. And what advice do you give to students who are kind of trying to pursue a similar kind of vein of documentary that you've done? What is it that you impart? What wisdom, not wanting your whole syllabus. Don't worry, I send the check in the mail. But like, what's the kind of, what advice do you give to people who are wanting to take on that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think, I'd love to kind of respond to your last point. I think it's related to, it's totally related to this advice I would give students. I think this idea of, there are these difficult stories like we've been talking about that are out in the world. And especially in my sort of corner of the profession in journalism, I would argue you can't be told like, this story is too difficult, so don't tell it, right? Like you sort of can't tell a journalist, cover this easy story and don't cover this other story because, there are too many barriers to telling the story. Like, I mean, imagine if journalists accepted that, we would have this, sort of teeny tiny perspective on what's happening because there's so many, difficult stories that, that the world needs to know about. And I think that's advice I would give to students that, this is our job to not turn away from these difficult stories that, you have in what we've been talking about, these, people in Afghanistan, these people in Yemen that are, sort of suffering from this sort of oppression or from war and are doing this kind of incredible heroic work that it's really our job to highlight. I really try to impress upon students or teach my students that, often the first step in trying to tell a story is getting a door sort of slammed in your face and having people say, no, you can't do this. And you have to persevere sort of beyond that. And, there may be many, many more doors that are slammed in your face, but you have to persevere. And it's really, these human stories from our own backyards or from across the globe that it's worth all of these sort of difficult aspects, in order to tell these incredible stories. So it's not easy, but I think the rewards of doing this work are pretty great, and being able to tell these stories and connect with these incredible people is pretty, it's pretty amazing.
Definitely. And if people are interested in either watching Saving Mes Aynak or seeing any of the work that you've done, where's the best way to kind of get more information on that?
Yes, good question. So Googling my name will bring up my university page where it has my contact information on it. But for Saving Mes Aynak, savingmesaynak.com is a great place to start. And there are many ways, pretty much any ways to stream the film that exist out there. You can stream Saving Mes Aynak, and you can also connect with me through that website as well.
Great. Thank you very, very much for your time today, Brent.
Great. Thank you. This has been really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Told you what you wanna hear. Why can't you see that the truth will set you free? Expose this modern myth with me. Modern myth. It's a modern myth, oh yeah.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.